Welcome, I'm Bill Wake. This is my weekly summary of the work I've been doing on Twitch. Lately, we've been working on Fiume, a personal finance tool that lets you look at your finances medium to long term. This last week or so, we've added relative amounts, which are amounts as a percentage of another. So an example of this is, say, three people own a house together. They each own a third. Or one spouse is collecting Social Security, they get half of the amount the other spouse collects. Second thing we did was refactoring. We have this notion of a Leia, which is a liability, expense, income, or asset. And up till now, it hasn't known its type, which one of those four it was. That was actually tracked in a plan object. And so we're moving that into the type. The tricky thing with that is that if you're changing a type like that, it changes our persistence. So we have to do it in a way that makes it safe to do. And then finally, we switched things so amounts get treated as positive. So when you have an expense, it lists as $500 expense. It doesn't list as negative $500. And this matches more closely to real life. You get a credit card statement. They don't say you owe minus $1,500. They say your balance is $1,500. All right, so persistence, we update Leia to know its type. And the challenge is, well, the real constraint is I don't want to break existing users' data. I don't have very many users, but they've entered information and they shouldn't have to start over because we changed our format. And the second constraint is when I'm imposing, I want to use the generated persistence. I'm kind of lazy about writing persistence. It's not that hard. It's just very boilerplate and boring. And I think I can avoid it. So I'm gonna use the generated one. And our approach is we're going to make any new fields optional. So the if those get read from an old file, those fields get left as nil, which is not a problem since they're optional. And we'll take those incoming objects and transform them so those fields aren't nil before we use them. All right, let's see a demo and a look at the code. All right, so I'm starting with a Social Security of $2,000 a month. Notice the total after 30 years is just under $750,000. So if we take half that and add again, it should be just over $1 million. So let's go ahead and add one. This relative value, it'll be an income stream. I really think this relative value probably shouldn't be done in amount. It probably should be done as another top level entry, but we'll do that in the future. So we'll call this one SS2. And the amount is relative. We'll make it 50% of SS1 and create that. Okay, and you can see, yeah, we're a little bit over $1 million. So we've added in that amount successfully. So that's kind of all there is to it. That's not a whole lot of benefit, but it gives you help for these situations like Social Security where you trying to decide trade-offs and see which one makes more sense. All right, let's look at code. I'm going to start with amount. So amount it formerly was just money, and so we had to grow it into a new type, the amount type that's an enum. Enums let you specify different cases. So we got one case where it's just money, and the second case where it's the percent and the name of the other stream. And so you can create instances of either one. We can tell you if it's non-negative, we just sort of default it to true for relatives. And then the big thing is you can compute the value. Well, if it's the money case, the money is just whatever amount is in there. If it's a relative case, we have to go find the scenario in our scenario, which is passed in. We have to find that name. So it was SS1 in our example. And, the current scenario, we only had one there, so it had no trouble finding it. But if it were more complicated, maybe the multiple scenarios stacked up together, it'd have to find the name in the current scenario. So it looks for that name. If it can't find it, it just defaults to 0. And otherwise, it takes the ratio, that's our percent, and works off the base amount. So whatever the base amount is in that scenario, in our case, it was $2,000 a month. Our ratio was 1/2, and so we get $1,000 a month coming back from that. Now we made this codable. We added some coding strings or coding keys. This case I'd called it money, and we changed, the original name was amount. So changing the field name means I have to do that. Okay, and relative was new, so it was fine. All right, so that's the relative stuff, the core of it anyway. Let's look at Leia. This is where we had to, or Leia, I say it both ways. We have this object that represents either streams or pools. And so I added a new type, a Leia type, that represents those four cases: asset, liability, income, or expense. And we also added an unspecified because our new, our old types don't have a type encoded, so we'll leave them unspecified. I'll come back to that computation. Then we have the Leia type itself. It's got coding keys for each field. And then you can see here, we added this Leia type field. Again, it's optional. We had a similar case. We had an amount field and we changed it to amount spec where it could be relative. And so we have a coding key that reflected that. But this change is really just focused on this Leia type. So it's a new field we're going to add in. If you ask for the type of a Leia, if it's got one, we use it. Otherwise, we default to unspecified. After we get the persistence deployed and everybody's upgraded, we'll be able to delete this case and probably just make the field readable instead. Okay, so we store the type, and there's not much involved there. If we want to know if it's non-negative, we ask the amount, and then computing the amount, we'll take a specific month and year, a group of people, because birthdays involve people, and a scenario. It's nullable. I think in the long run, we want to get rid of that nullable case. The old version, all it ever worked with was money, and you could just ask what the amount was anytime. But the new version, calculating the amount is really something that only happens in the context of a scenario. So this is sort of an intermediate step to getting rid of the nil assignment there, and just saying pass in the scenario you're in. Don't try and compute amounts for things that don't have amounts yet. So again, if I have scenarios involved, there's no generic amount that's true. Maybe I have a relative amount into two different scenarios, and I don't know which scenario is going to be active until I know it. So we'll do that. Now here we get back to the type, which was asset, liability, etc. And we're having the type compute the signed amount. And this is the part I mentioned about treating everything as non-negative. It's non-negative when it's stored as an amount, but if you're computing the value, because you're going to sum up expenses versus income and so on, we need to know the correct sign for it. So assets and income come in positive, liabilities and expenses come in negative. Once the conversion is done, I know all my monies are converted to positive, and so I'll be able to drop this absolute value because it'll be implicit. All right, and then the persistence is the real work in this. That wasn't too hard to do. Okay, so the difference is, when you open the app, we have two persistent sets that we create. One is the people, and then one is the plans. So we open our plans and we tell them use plans as the type of this thing. And once it builds new plans, we tell the current plans object, the persistent one that's our state up here, we tell it, hey, load that from the plans we just read. Okay, and that's what gave us our opportunity to transform it. So we start with the plans, we just take them as is, but then we call update on them. And update is our function to transform our input, so after it's loaded, everything's ready for the real job. Okay, and in the current plan, recall that it kind of knows which ones are pools and which ones are streams. Well, the old way was plan knows if it's pool or stream, and then the value being positive or negative tells you if it's asset or asset, liability, or income or expense. Okay, and then we also have groups and scenarios that are basically tree nodes with more children. Okay, so our update is a recursive call that says if you hit one of these leaf nodes, pools, or streams, then just replace the replace the Leia that's involved. Okay, so there's whatever plan that whatever Leia that plan contains, we're going to replace it. And this asset liability thing is so we can make a decision about, is this thing, is it positive or negative, basically. Okay, so those two cases replace Leia. The third case is just the recursive case. This is the update function. We just call each child and tell it to update. So we're working our way down the tree till we hit those leaves and update them with the right values. Okay, so what makes it a right value? Okay, so we come in, we've got the plan, and the plan contains a Leia that, one of those four types. And so we compute the new type, and that's going to be based on the Leia itself. And then what should we call it if it's positive, and what should we call it if it's negative? So let's peek down there. Okay, so if the type is not unspecified, if it's already set, like we're reading a file that's already in the correct format, we just return it. But if it's unspecified, type takes care of deciding if it's nil or not. So, okay, that's why. So if it's not unspecified, we just return it. If it is unspecified because it was nil, we compute basically, are you negative or positive, and we decide. So the first one was, one of them was asset or liability, and the other was income versus expense. Past tense, the positive and negative. Okay, now once you have the new type, we're going to build a new Leia object and then replace it. The new object has the same ID and name. We force it to be non-negative, so it conforms to our new approach. And we take its old dates and we take the new type and replace that object, and we're all set. Okay, force non-negative. If it's money, we take the absolute value. Otherwise, we just leave it as a relative. Okay, and as I look at this code now, let's see. These lines were kind of there before without the update, so we had 3 or 4 lines there, but everything from 21 down to 64, that's all there because of the persistence and trying to make sure we can read the old file and the new file formats. The rest of it is basically another 20 or 25 lines. So more than half is basically dealing with the persistence at this point. It would be even more if it weren't codable and I had to write my own decode encode routines. But I'm trying to stay away from that. Once this is deployed, I'll be able to remove most of this code. We'll probably have to do more because we have other changes we want to make to Leia next week, but that's okay. It'll keep us going. All right, so next week we'll do the cleanup kind of first thing, assuming I have confirmed that we have our updates done. And that'll be it's kind of a database refactoring sort of thing. It's not really a database, but it's kind of the same concept. You put something in, you make sure everybody's switched over to the new version, and then you change it some more. So we have that cleanup side. Next thing I want to do after that is support the idea of variables. So this comes in kind of on multiple levels. One is we'd like to handle growth and inflation, but I want you to just be able to say, kind of generic growth is 6%, or what if it's 10%, or what if it's 2%? And then inflation, what if that's a certain percent? That'll be one use of variables. I also want to be able to use variables to say, start Social Security when I'm at age 67, and that I want a variable that could represent like Social Security starts, and another variable for what if I die, or things like that. All those dates that might come in. And I think you could also do amounts. I could see a case for amounts in certain situations. So we'll take all those. I don't know if we'll get past the variables this week. We'll see. All right. I'd love to have you join us. We're on Twitch Monday through Thursday, 2 to 4:30 Eastern, or 6 to 8:30 p.m. UTC. If you go to xp123.com/Twitch at the right time, you'll get to the live session. Or you can go to xp123.com/YouTube. You'll get the old sessions a couple weeks or so delayed and lightly edited. All right. Well, thanks for joining today, and I hope I catch you in the future. Bye-bye.